A new relationship between the United States and Egypt. Donald Trump gives a White House welcome to the Egyptian president. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is told, "You have a great friend and ally." Does the US have a new approach to the Middle East? And what will Egypt's role be? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Nick Clark. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is the first Egyptian president to visit Washington in almost 8 years. It's a shift in US policy. The Obama administration had a tense relationship with Sisi after the ousting of President Mohamed Morsi in 2013. President Donald Trump welcomed him to the White House on Monday. Issues ranging from military aid to fighting so-called terrorism were discussed. Protesters outside condemned what they call gross human rights abuses in Egypt. The presidents praised each other to reporters.
President el-Sisi has been somebody that's been very close to me from the first time I met him. I just want to let everybody know, in case there was any doubt, that we are very much behind President el-Sisi. He's done a fantastic job in a very difficult situation.
Since we met last September, I've had a deep appreciation and admiration of your unique personality, especially as you are standing very strong in the counter-terrorism field.
All right, now let's bring in our guests. I'm pleased to say from Washington, D.C., we have Michelle Dunn, who is Director of the Middle East Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In New York, Dalia Boureau, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Long Island University and a member of the Egyptian Rule of Law Association. And also in Washington, D.C., Shibli Talami, Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident senior fellow at the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to you all. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Now, let me start first of all with you, Shibli Talami. After years of disengagement, it's back on, US and Egypt, apparently the best of friends. It's good for the region and good for global stability, isn't it?
Well, first of all, I'm not really sure what has changed other than the atmospherics. Some of what we saw yesterday, of course, is not surprising at all, in the sense that Mr. Trump has said he was going to support President Sisi and Egypt and see them as a cornerstone of his fight on ISIS and Islamic militancy, and wasn't going to pay much attention to what happens internally in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world. And it's no secret that President Sisi saw in Trump as a potential ally. So none of this is really surprising. The atmospherics are great. They praise each other. Everyone in the world has learned that if you want to score with Mr. Trump, just praise him as much as you could. So that looks good. The question is, has anything profoundly changed? That's really the question. Okay, well, we don't know yet.
Okay, we'll get into that in just a second. Let me just bring in our other guest. Dalia Boureau, do you think this is anything more than a kind of symbolic validation of Sisi, a good optic, as it were?
Well, optics do matter, not just for international relations, but also for domestic politics, both in the United States and especially inside of Egypt. What we saw that, this is the first Egyptian leader to come to the United States since President Mubarak. There had been a concerted effort, whether it translated into policy or not, that we were not going to engage with repressive leaders, especially post-Arab Spring. With President Sisi coming to the United States, being the first, for example, to congratulate President Trump on his election and wanting to be the first Arab leader to come to the United States, signals that we're entering into a time period where we will be playing the game of choosing to support authoritarian leaders, both publicly and behind the scenes, to get our foreign policy objectives met. And President Sisi was very successful in taking advantage of the moment. He had regionally started to lose a lot of cachet with a rising Turkey, a rising Iran, a rising Saudi Arabia, and Israel being much more important regional players. And so he's now situating himself as the Arab leader that will be patting Trump on the back and expecting a pat on the back in return.
Michelle Dunn, isn't it the case, though, that all new U.S. presidents like to reset relations with the Egyptian president? When Obama first took office, he did it with Mubarak, didn't he?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And not only with Egypt, right? We've seen presidents pushing reset buttons with Russia and other countries. But it's true that President Obama thought that his predecessor, George W. Bush, had been too tough on Mubarak, specifically on things related to human rights. And Obama reset the relationship with Mubarak back on a more traditional, realpolitik, national security footing. So we see Trump now doing that with Sisi. Of course, there is a difference in the sense that the situation inside of Egypt now is more extreme than it was under Mubarak. The human rights abuses are unprecedented that are going on in Egypt now since 2013 up to the present. The political repression, also the very bad economic situation and the military domination of the economy. So all of these things were problems under Mubarak when Obama came into office and sort of discarded Bush's freedom agenda. But they're even more extreme now with Trump and with Sisi in office in Egypt.
You mentioned human rights, and Dalia, given that human rights are such an important issue in Egypt, and given that Trump made no mention of them whatsoever, do we assume that this issue was completely ignored? There was some talk by officials that all this was pushed to a conversation behind the scenes.
So currently today there are between 50 and 60,000 political prisoners. There are 23 journalists being held in Egypt according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. There have been military tribunals for civilians. There's been a clamping down on journalists. There have been 17 people who were just sentenced before Sisi came to the United States for a 2015 protest. And there are 7 Americans currently being held in Egyptian jails, not for criminal behavior, but for protest actions or for heading NGOs or for trying to help out the poor. And so it's not so much what was said yesterday as much as what was not said. And even if there was going to be a push behind the scenes for human rights, which it's not clear that did happen, when President Trump says Sisi is doing, and I quote, a fantastic job, we agree on many things, this transactional lens doesn't necessarily signal that we're taking human rights abuses very seriously.
Isn't it just a tragic fact of modern diplomacy, Dalia, that state interest always will trump issues of human rights and so forth?
Well, that is true, because we have continued to see that the national interest is very much separate than human interest, which is highly problematic. And I'll remind you, words do matter. You know, I know that Trump is running on a platform of I'm just being more honest with what reality is, but aspirational language matters. When we think about the Declaration of Independence, for example, in the United States saying that all men are created equal, well, we know today that there is structural racism. Having aspirational goals is very important. Having democracy promotion be the agenda is very important, because you're also playing a signaling game with the Arab street or with Egyptians on the ground. And when you continue to say that we do no longer care about your democratic aspirations, we do not care about the conditions or the situation that led you to the streets during the Arab Spring or the outcome of the Arab Spring, what you are signaling is that democracy is not necessarily for all. And if the U.S. is going to stand for its democratic values and ideals, the language has to be taken seriously.
Shibli, on to you, Shibli Talhami in Washington, D.C. You posed the thought a little bit earlier. The question is, has anything changed? Do you think it has?
Yeah, well, first of all, on human rights, obviously this is not a good time for human rights in America or around the world. And frankly, when you look at Trump, I mean, this is a guy who obviously isn't paying much attention to the nature of our human rights, and in some cases, the Constitution itself. Obviously, he's not going to pay much attention to human rights and democracy around the world, and he said that already. So that is unfortunate, but it's not surprising given who he is. I mean, obviously the opposition to him by many people, in fact, maybe now the majority of the American people, disapproval of him is clearly broader than just a relationship with Egypt. But I would say here on this particular issue specifically, I'm not really sure. I think both sides may end up being disappointed for different reasons. I'm not sure what the photo op will do for Sisi practically, because frankly, people thought that Trump would be much stronger today than he is in reality. His disapproval rating is so high that embracing him may actually backfire. Certainly he doesn't have the same standing in Arab and Muslim countries, including in Egypt. people are mixed on him. Here in America, we see what the numbers are. So the embrace may not actually be good. So the question is, what would it do in practice? I mean, we saw the Obama administration, yes, didn't invite Sisi, but clearly continued its military and intelligence cooperation because they see Egypt as important. They don't want Egypt to fall apart. This President Trump is not offering a lot more money because he's anti-American aid, and so the military may get a little bit more than it wanted. But it's really not clear whether, in fact, Trump is going to use Sisi to put pressure on the Palestinians to make a deal that he thinks he can deliver. That's really the question. That's what we should be talking about, because all the other stuff I think we have no control over.
All right, Shibli, thanks very much indeed. Hold on there, all of you, if you would, just for a moment. I just want to sort of look back at the history of this relationship, because despite some differences in foreign policy, the US has long seen Egypt as a friend. Their strategic partnership started back in 1979 when Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat signed the Camp David treaty with Israel. Egypt has received billions of dollars in military and economic aid every year since. Their relationship stayed strong throughout President Hosni Mubarak's 30-year rule until 2011, and it survived the overthrow of Mubarak and the election of President Mohamed Morsi. When Army Commander Abdel Fattah el-Sisi helped depose Morsi, then replace him as president, the relationship with the United States worsened. The Obama administration temporarily cut aid, in fact, and never invited, as we've discussed, Sisi to the White House. It's a very different story now. Michelle, if I can come to you, Michelle Dunn in Washington, D.C. Both sides, Shibli just mentioned the fact that his view was that both sides may end up being disappointed with how things turn out. What are your thoughts?
I think Shibli's right about that. For President Sisi, President Sisi, frankly, has really chased Trump. I think he tried to be, the first person to call Trump to congratulate him. I think he actually tried to attend the inauguration. I mean, in other words, he really has pursued Trump avidly. And there is this question as to what is going to happen with U.S. military and economic assistance to Egypt. And the signals on that are quite interesting. In the first budget that the Trump administration put out, Egypt's military assistance would have been converted to a loan rather than a grant, and its economic assistance cut altogether. Now, that's just the opening in a long negotiation between the White House and Congress over the budget. But it was a signal, and an even more important signal came during this visit just yesterday. An unnamed U.S. official told a wire service that Sisi has come here hoping for more assistance. He's going to be disappointed. He's not going to get it. So it's not even clear right now whether Sisi is going to get as much military and economic assistance from Trump as he got from Obama, because even though assistance was suspended for a while, eventually it was all returned to Egypt. So that could certainly be a disappointment and an embarrassment for Sisi back in Egypt if it looks like all he got was a handshake and a smile, but then actually material assistance from the U.S. goes down. For Trump's part, look, I think that President Trump will learn, just as President Obama did and President Bush before him, that the internal mess inside of Egypt is going to affect this partnership. It's going to affect U.S. interests, and it's going to make Sisi perhaps a less useful partner than Trump might hope that he will be.
So are you saying then that the United States would do well to focus on getting Egypt stabilized and help get it back on its feet? The United States would have a vested interest in that?
Look, yes, the U.S. has an interest in it. How much the U.S. is really able to do is another question. I think there are limits to what we're able to do. Really, frankly, what the United States is able to do is decide what it will support and what it will not support inside of Egypt. It's not able to micromanage Egypt or control or put pressure, on that many decisions and so forth inside of Egypt. I think the U.S. has some leverage, and it's just a question of deciding, where to put it and where not to put it. And it's very difficult and complicated to do. But the United States can express with its words and with its actions, even more so with its actions and where it puts its assistance and so forth, what kind of a course for Egypt it's supporting. I mean, for example,
I'll tell you what,
by
just jump in there. I want to bring in
more to youth.
Forgive me for interrupting. I want to bring in Dalia. Dalia, if I was to say to you, itemize for me where you see the possibilities, the optimism in this meeting, what would you say?
I think President Sisi came here with an agenda besides just the symbolic handshake. I think he really wants the United States, he wants the Trump administration to designate the Muslim Brotherhood, which continues to be a thorn in his side, as a terrorist organization. I think he came here with a list of Egyptians in the diaspora community that he wants extradited to Egypt. I think he wants to clamp down on voices of dissent both inside and outside of Egypt. Now, on the U.S. side, it's in our vested interest to continue to ensure that Egypt remains governable. If we look at the economic conditions that Egypt finds itself in, with great inflation, really difficult times falling on the population, where a majority now actually live in poverty simply because basic needs can't be met with the devaluation, or the Egyptian pound now being $1 to 18 Egyptian pounds. And so with those economic conditions, you might end up having a country where not just is there an increase in repression, but also an increase in terrorist activity, an increase in possible ungovernability. So the United States really has to be very careful with the calculations it makes vis-a-vis a country like Egypt. So Sisi's agenda coming here might not be met. It might be a failure on his end, because all he will get is that awkward handshake he got yesterday and the kind of pat on the back of, you're a great guy. And so that pathological authoritarian behavior or narrative that he needs to validate himself, he might receive to a certain extent, but the real substantive activity, work, and aid that Egypt needs to get back on the right track might not necessarily be there.
Shibli, as I say, there could be possibilities down the line. The Israel-Palestinian issue is the kind of seemingly impossible issue that Donald Trump would relish in solving. Is it possible with Sisi and board to push the peace process forward?
Well, first of all, I think if you say what is the accomplishment here other than the patting of the back, which is obvious what happened, I think the two men obviously have some rapport with each other. They work together. They both are so much focused on personal relations and diplomacy that this actually could be an asset for the relations down the road, even regardless of what the issues are. I mean, don't underestimate that, particularly with presidents who rely heavily on personal diplomacy, as this one does. So some things may come out of it. But if you look at it objectively, like on the Israel-Palestine front, to go directly to your question, I think it's, the reality of it is there's nothing in this administration so far, in terms of what the president has said, what he has done, the people he's appointed, that indicates that he's prepared to ask the Israelis to compromise at a level even half of what Obama was asking, which wasn't enough anyway. So the question is how they see this relationship with the Arab rulers, particularly, not just with Egypt, but with the Gulf states, particularly where he has close relations with the United Arab Emirates and with Saudi Arabia, and also perhaps with Jordan, with King Abdullah of Jordan. The question is whether this administration sees the bilateral relationship as so important, in the sense that what Sisi wants is something for Egypt, what the Saudis want is something for Saudi Arabia, perhaps related to Iran, what the UAE wants is something particular to its relations with the U.S., that they may be prepared to, in essence, put pressure on the Palestinians just to get what they want. That's kind of what I see coming out of this administration. And everybody will be disappointed because, frankly, no one can deliver those kind of compromises. And I think we're in for a rocky period ahead.
Michelle, the region, of course, as we all know, is rife with fundamental issues. It is in the United States' interest to have Egypt on board to help try and solve some of those things. You go from the Israel-Palestine issue to ISIL to Yemen to Syria. Can you see in any of those arenas any room where there may be progress made because of this apparent new relationship?
Well, look, I take what Shibli says, that if Trump and el-Sisi have a good personal relationship, that might be of some utility. But I think that the approach that Egypt is taking to a lot of these regional issues is very fraught. By the way, I think there's reason to believe that Trump did el-Sisi a significant favor. It seems as though that the United States played a role in brokering not only the Saudi-Iraqi rapprochement, but possibly the Saudi-Egyptian rapprochement as well. That is certainly a value to Sisi if Trump did that for him, and that may actually be the most important thing that Sisi is taking away from this new relationship. But that Sisi's approach to a lot of issues is really skewed because of the internal situation with the Palestinians. For example, Sisi's ongoing sort of internal war with the Muslim Brotherhood really skews his relationship with the Palestinians. He's not been able to deal with Hamas in the same way that Mubarak did, even with Fattah, even with the PLO. If Sisi has chosen a side, and it's not the side of President Abbas in the internal Fatah struggle. That too, choosing Mohammed Dahlan over Abu Mazen in that internal struggle is also related to Sisi's struggle against the Brotherhood. So there are a lot of ways. This also applies to Libya, in which Egypt is not the kind of reasonably balanced, even-handed party that it was seen as, for example, under Mubarak. I mean, Mubarak, he did a lot of bad things inside Egypt, but in terms of his regional role, he was a kind of trusted senior statesman, and he really could play a role with the Palestinians. I'm not sure Sisi can do the same thing. He doesn't have the same stature, and his own relationships are very complicated in the region.
All of which begs the question, Dalia, is why did the Trump administration set up lay out the red carpet for Sisi and set up this grand state visit?
Well, I think they were looking for there's a lot going on. There's also the personalities involved here, and I think they were looking for a leader who was going to come and be extremely happy to be in the presence of President Trump, whose agendas are similar, who are both pushing for the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, which of course has already happened in Egypt, but is being pushed here in the United States. And so I'm going to push back on the idea that the relationship with Sisi is good for diplomacy. Because if Sisi gets his agenda passed, if he really, for example, gets the Muslim Brotherhood designation passed through the Trump administration, this is going to actually hurt diplomacy. What does it mean for example, the Justice and Development Party in Morocco? What does it mean for relations in Turkey, or the Iraqi Islamic Party that the United States relies heavily on? And so this essentially might hurt the rest of the diplomatic behavior within the greater region. And so I don't think it's, choosing one or the other, but how can we use one to mitigate other relationships?
Okay, I'm going to jump in there, Dalia, because we're just coming towards the end of the show. I do apologize for jumping in, but I just want to bring in Shibli for one last time. This idea of the Muslim Brotherhood being designated as a terrorist organization, which is something that President Sisi wants, he didn't get it this time round. Could you see the point at which that Donald Trump might accede to that request and denounce them as a terrorist organization?
Well, let's not try to predict Donald Trump, because none of us can, and so of course it could happen. But realistically, the reason why it hasn't happened so far is not because Obama just wasn't ready to do it personally. If you look at the American political institutions, national security, State Department, intelligence, Department of Defense, they all think it would only lead to more terrorism. So there's a whole analytical point of view that is out there in the American political establishment, and that certainly counters that, even aside from the consequences from countries outside of Egypt itself. So I see a big pushback, and that's one reason why he may not want to do it, even if he wants to. That is Trump. But I want to say one more thing. let's not underestimate the fact that there is some overlap in strategic thinking between Sisi and Trump. Certainly on Islamic militant groups, Sisi, unlike many of his allies in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar,
I'm going to have to jump
really
in there.
wasn't supporting.
I'm going to have to jump in there. We have run out of time. We didn't have enough time in the end to discuss everything that we needed to. We do appreciate it. Michelle Dunn, Dalia Boureau, and Shibli Talami, thanks very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation, of course, on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.